Ihejirika is a professor of development communications, University of Port Harcourt. He joins us via Zoom. We also have Professor Ademola Abass, who is an international law and global affairs analyst, also joining us via Zoom. Gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for joining us today on the program. Well, what a scenario. The meeting, the northern leaders having that meeting yesterday and coming up with resolutions, which, as reported in the dailies. Well, let's start off with your general impression of the outcome of that meeting in terms of some of the highlights. They've talked about the social media, they talked about policing, they talked about plan to topple government. Well, Professor Ihejirika, what do you think of this? We'll try and sort that out with Professor Ihejirika so we can just get his sound correctly. But Professor Abass, you can hear me, I guess. Tell us what your impression was about those recommendations, the highlights of the meeting of northern leaders concerning the national security and NSAS protests.
Can you hear me?
Okay, I heard you. Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, Chamberlain. Good morning, Ayo. Thank you so much for having me. Well, look, in the first place, there's nothing wrong for a particular region to have a meeting. I mean, Southwestern governors paid a visit to Governor Sanwo-Olu, and we've had this over and over. One would have wished that all the governors in Nigeria in the first place, came together to address a national issue, or national issues, as it were. But be that as it may, the outcomes, a mixed grill. On the one hand, you have an affirmation of the need to reform policing, which I think nobody would question that in the country. The old issue about the ASU strike and and so on and so forth. But look, when you take a step back, I think to start talking about people who want to pursue a some separatist, agenda and this and that, I don't think it's something that is the kind of thing that this kind of meeting should actually focus on. You cannot, on the one hand, be talking about the countries being indivisible, which we all signed to, we all agree to, under certain circumstances, that is. And on the other hand, be throwing shades here and there and, be saying that, the NSA protests were instigated by, fake news and social media. That just, I'm sorry to say, is an unacceptable, a palpable insult to the sensibility of all Nigerians, not just youths who went out on behalf of all of us, by the way, to demonstrate against police brutality and against a particular arm of the policing, a kind of goon called SARS, that I don't think even the police establishment or anybody in the country was actually proud of. So to then throw all those things into the bag and say, look, these things were, the protests were instigated by, fake news is just, I'm sorry to say, it just complete. It just blew me apart totally. So
Professor,
I'm not.
Yeah. Professor Ihejirika, if you can hear us now, what's your first impression of the resolutions of the Northern Governors Forum's meeting yesterday? Do we have Professor Ihejirika joining us now? Please go ahead, if you can hear me. Maybe you might need to unmute. Okay, Prof, if you can hear us, you may need to just unmute so that we can hear you. I mean, sometimes these things can happen. But while we'll let you do that, if you haven't, I guess, the point Professor Abass made about the fake news component, well, Prof, that his comments, the comments occurred to him saying that the scenario in Uheli in Delta State, because the text there was saying that the scenario there did not involve NSAS in Delta State in Uheli. And he says that was all of these protests were predicated or sparked off by that singular incident. Now, two things. yes, there's been concerns about the activities, the conduct of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad way before that incident in Uheli. And so perhaps it was maybe those already pre-existing impressions that people had, perhaps it was fueled by this incident, which was not connected to fake news. So is it that if his comment was based on fact, he shouldn't have made it at this time, or he should have, how should he have approached it if he felt this is a fact of the matter? Professor Bass, that's for you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know that it was so. Look, Chamberlain, for me, what is important, to be honest with you, whether it's what happened in Delta or not, or this and that. Look, I'm a lawyer by training. You know, when you have courses, you have immediate courses, you have, remote courses. A course is nonetheless, you can't say a course is less effective simply because it happened 1 billion years ago. Things accumulate. The truth is, things have accumulated in Nigeria. Nigerians have had problems with policing in this country. In fact, to be honest with you, with the whole raft of enforcement agencies in Nigeria. And part of the challenge, we are not focusing on Chamberlain, I will tell you, is that we are in a democratic dispensation. There is need for a democratic control of enforcement agencies in Nigeria. You have a system in which Nigeria has gone through a long period of military regime, and we emerge from that into some kind of democracy. I say some kind of deliberately, some kind of democracy. And then we think that the same apparatus of the state, that is the military, the armed forces, or whatever you have, will simply subject themselves to democratic controls of the democratic institutions. It does not happen overnight. So I don't really want to waste too much time on all this nitty-picking, saying it happened in Delta, is this and that. No, the truth is we should have been dealing with police reform 1 billion years ago. We should have been dealing with subjecting the entirety of our enforcement agencies to democratic controls. Look, just the other day, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, I read in the newspapers that the panel sitting in Lagos invited the military, and the military refused to come. They said they won't. I mean, if what I read in the news, I hope it's not fake news. It was in the print media. They wouldn't come, and they wouldn't even yield the names of those who perpetuated crimes or the shooting at Lekki. Don't let's forget one thing. The first thing the Nigerian army did after the shooting that Black Tuesday was to come and say it was a fake news. There was something that came specifically from the military that was a fake news. Of course, then they then went back and said, well, in any case, we were invited by the Lagos State government. So between fake news and we were invited by the Lagos State government, who is lying and who's being truthful here? I'm not even coming to the issue of now, dealing with social media, but I'm talking about the fact that we cannot just, take all these things as they are anymore. So there have been issues consistently that we needed to have approached long ago in the country, and they are coming to the fore. So don't let's waste our time by thinking it's what happened in Ugeli, it's what happened in Oyingbo, it's what happened in Ijeshaland. I was like, no. Every Nigerian knows today what problems this country confronts. And for me, the earlier we begin to think seriously now, at least talking about, policing and this and that, the earlier we begin to address the issue of democratic control of enforcement agents in the country, the better for us. I think that is a very serious issue that I think we need to start focusing on for now.
Well, one of the things that the northern governors also resolved at that meeting yesterday was to find a role for traditional rulers in the governance architecture of the country. That existed very many years ago in Nigeria, and I think along the line that tapered off. Could you backtrack, if you can, to when we operated that, what happened, and what do we need to do, if at all you see the need for us to bring that back? First of all, for you, does it have value? If it does, backtrack and let's see what we can do to make it better.
I imagine that question is for me, right?
Please, go ahead.
Fantastic. Now, there is no modicum of doubt in my mind that traditional rulers have a significant role to play in our governance architecture in Nigeria. Let me take you back to history. We all probably can still recall what happened in the days of the Western region and the crisis in the West and this and that between the, MPC government in the central and the AG in the West and so on and so forth. But we saw some roles played by some traditional rulers. And permit me to mention Saje Sode Aderemi, who was the first governor in Black Africa of a region at that point in time. Now, I am not apportioning blame, so I'm saying somebody was right or wrong, but I was looking at the role, I think it's Imperial Majesty, the Honor of Ife then, Adesoja Aderemi, played in that particular time. One thing that actually stuck to me was the fact that the king at that point in time, Honor of Ife, was rigorously defending the constitutionality of the action and the constitutional process of the question of who had the right, to consider the parliament or to ask the premier or not to swear in the premier, which he had authority to do. Let's forget about the politics of it. At the end of the day, it was removed from power and so on and so forth. But what I'm talking about is that it played a critical role in guiding the constitution, but then that also became the problem. Where do you draw the line between the role of a traditional ruler as an unbiased umpire in a democratic or in a political dispensation? In other words, a very slippery slope. And it wasn't too long ago in this country, I think it was during the same Buhari Diagbon regime, that we saw probably the massive collision between traditional institution and the modern institution, in which some, I think the Dasuki, Oni, and some other were restricted to their particular domains at a point in time. But be that as it may, traditional rulers are the first port of call at the grassroots governance. And part of the problem we confront in the country today, just like policing itself, is that we have removed governance too far from the people it is meant for. Point blank. If there's a problem in my locality, one person that I see constantly, one person that talks to me constantly is my Bale, is my local chiefs, is people I relate with on a daily basis, people I sit with. I don't think about the governor in the state capital when I'm probably 1,000 miles away, hundreds of miles away from the person. So traditional rulers have a critical role, to play in the governance architecture of this country. The question is, how can they discharge that particular role? How can they perform that particular role without compromising the sanctity and the sanctimoniosity of their particular institution? That is very important. They are the custodians of our values and cultures. We should not, overlook that. Then number two is the question of how can they play this role in a system in which you have people who traditionally do not respect civilians. That is, whether you are a traditional ruler or not. I'm talking about the armed forces now. Traditionally, you see a soldier saying you are a bloody civilian anyway. How do traditional rulers operate in a society that is still governed largely by those people? Look, most people, part of the problem we have in security in Nigeria, somebody made to observe, the commander-in-chief was ex-military, the NSA was ex-military, almost everybody in that state was ex-military. So we are in a democracy, but we're in a democracy that is dressed, I would rather say we're in a kind of a funny kind of government that is dressed in the toga of democracy, believing democracy is just casting a ballot. If traditional rulers must operate within that particular framework, then there is need for a bit of sitting down with them and letting them understand how best they can discharge that particular function without compromising the integrity of their office.
Let me bring in Professor Ihejirika at this point, and let's try and see if we've been able to sort that out. Can you hear us now, Professor Ihejirika? Well, we can see you, but we're just trying to see if you can hear us. Okay, well, that has not been sorted yet, but I guess they'll communicate with you, behind the scenes and see how we can sort that out. But, Professor Abass, now, yes, I haven't made that point. I was going to say the reasons, because look at the people who were present there. The Minister of Information was there, President of the Senate equally there, and then the IGP giving his narrative. Now, these are key people in that question as to the social media censorship. That is a big one as well. So they equally concluded that something needed to be done about social media. As a result of, they say, look, this whole thing they felt was predicated on a false narrative, and as such, they need to go ahead and censor social media. How does that sit with you?
All right, thanks, Chamberlain. Look, number one, I think the debate about social media has been deeply polarized. You know, social media actually is regulated. There is a moderation of social media by private entities, whether you are Google, whether you are Facebook, whether you are Twitter, whatever. There is private regulation of social media. I think what they are talking about is public control of social media. That is the true government. Look, let's be honest here. I do not think there is anybody in the world, any government in the world that is going to say one way or the other, it will not. Can you hear me?
But we'll come to you
Yes,
soon.
I can.
Just hold. Okay, just hang on a minute. Good. Just hold on. As soon as Professor Abass concludes, we'll come to you. Go ahead, Professor Abass.
I was saying that I don't think there's anybody who will say that there shouldn't be some level of control of social media. And as I say, it already exists. But you have to ask yourself a question. Why is Nigerian government now so gung-ho about controlling social media at this particular point in time? One, it has been what happened about NSAS had been now linked with fake news. Now, if I take that, and as I said earlier on, the military came out to deny flatly what happened in Lekki. They were not there. They said they were not there. It was all fake news. Now, who is being fake here? The military represent the Nigerian government. So they put out an information that was deeply fake. Should I then say, I as a civilian, I want to regulate the military in Nigeria? That is the first question, because the first issue of fake news that we had during that crisis came from the Nigerian institution called the military itself. So should we then be calling for civilian regulation of the military? That is the first question. Now, the second question is that, look, you have to balance the control of any media, whether print or whatsoever, with the fundamental human rights of the people. The Nigerian Constitution grants human rights. Agreed. Human rights have limits. Human rights will not, can be derogated in some specific circumstances. But we have to be careful to make sure that we do not sleepwalk into a totalitarianism in Nigeria. And that is my greatest fear. I heard somebody, one of the people in authority, maybe the Minister for Information or whoever, was talking the other day, a few days ago, saying that, or even in China, they couldn't use Google and this and that. Nigeria is not China, I'm sorry to say. The last time I checked, Nigeria is a democracy. Our democracy is failing. Our democracy is ailing. Our democracy is sick. But in a way, we are still a democracy. We are working to make it better. So we should not take steps that will make it worse. So now coming out and saying you want to clamp down on social media, let me ask you a simple question. Suppose there was no social media when Lekki happened. I'm using Lekki because it has become a metaphor of our collective lies, collective failure, collective irresponsibility, collective insensitivity, and collective detective agency that we saw at some point.
All right, Professor Abass.
Suppose there was no social media at Lekki, what do you think will have happened?
Okay, let's bring in Professor Ihejirika at this point in time. Well, so much to unpack, but first, the comments of the IGP saying all of this was predicated on falsehood, and so they thought that something needs to be done about social media as the meeting agreed. So tell us your impressions about that particular decision concerning censoring social media.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me now.
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Sorry for the mix-up earlier on. I think it was due to the earpiece. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And we have followed the goings-on with regard to the statements about regulating the social media, and especially after the meeting yesterday of the Northern Governors. We do know that the Minister of Information has been all over the place also for a long time talking about this regulation of the social media. The first thing we need to say is that we need to say that the social media is a different media platform from the traditional media. And it is easier to regulate the traditional media than the social media, because in the traditional media, the gatekeeping roles of the journalists are easier to regulate than in the social media, where the general public are both the producers and consumers of media content. So the difficulty there is that the gatekeeping is harder in the social media than in the traditional media. So, but the point is that the government is not yet clear about which aspect of the regulation of the social media they are really talking about. Is it about regulating people's access to the social media, or is it about regulating the kind of content that goes into the social media? If it is about regulating the content that goes into social media, I think the best, the people that have to be in play are the operators or the owners of the platforms, like we know the major platforms, Google, Facebook, and so on. So it's to know how to ask them to moderate the content. And moderating the content is giving some guidelines about things that have to enter into the platforms and things that are, not allowed, especially things that, deal with violence and, hate speech and so on. But as far as we know, most of these major media platforms have already put in place what they call community rules and, of engagement. So there are already many rules they have that help them to moderate the content, that do kind of, post facto kind of regulation on content that are posted on their platforms. We know for sure that sometimes they send warnings to people who post images that are not allowed. Sometimes they even can lock out some people who repeatedly keep on posting images that are not allowed or that are against the community rules. So if these things are already in place, one wonders then, what again is the government talking about in terms of regulating the social media? So in that aspect, I think there's need for some kind of transparency from the government to come out clear and let us know what are they talking about in terms of regulating the social media. Is it regulating access, as is done in some non-democratic countries, like my colleague mentioned about China? These are non-democratic countries. They regulate access to the social media. They can bar their citizens from accessing some social medias like YouTube, like Facebook, and so on. But that's not a democratic setup. So if you're talking about a democratic setup, we need to come clear and know precisely what aspect of social media regulation that we are dealing with here in the country. And I think up to now, I don't think the government has been able to make a clear representation on this. And that is why there's a lot of suspicion among the citizenry that the government wants to lock out people from social media. They want to shut people out. They don't want free expressions and all that. So what I'm saying is that there is need for clear and precise ideas about what this regulation is all about.
All right, we'll go to break, but we'll return and continue our conversation on some of the recommendations and the highlights of the Northern Leaders meeting which occurred yesterday. Welcome back. Still talking about part of the resolutions of the Northern Leaders meeting, some of which included there's this plan. They say social media has got to be censored. They need to ensure that some of these things don't go out of place because they felt that there were subversive elements who took advantage of that protests and eventually it spiraled out of control. So they reject and condemn those subversive actions of the NSAS protest. And then they call for major control mechanism and censorship of the social media practice in Nigeria. They equally spoke about traditional rulers who they think should be given formal roles in the governance architecture of the country. So there are several other recommendations, but which you get to see as we progress. So, but we still do have two gentlemen with us, Professor Ademola Abass, International Law and Global Affairs Analyst, as well as Professor Walter Ihejirika, who is of Development Communication, University of Port Harcourt. So, Professor Ihejirika, about you speaking about the content or what exactly do they want to regulate about social media? How should they proceed with some of these things? So from some of the narratives they've given, if the IGP says, look, there's been an issue here, there's a problem which they think should be addressed in order not to allow quote-unquote subversive elements even take advantage of the social media, and then who knows how things could spiral out of control. So do you oppose their quest to go about that regulation, or is it how they are communicating their intention to Nigerians, as a result of which it seems to be resisted? Because the National Assembly will equally have a huge role to play, because the President of the Senate was equally there, and he thought, well, it might just be about time. So what key issues do you think they are missing and should be addressed differently?
All right, thank you very much. Like I pointed out earlier on, the government needs to come out clear and let the Nigerian citizens know the Nigerian citizens should know what they are really talking about when it comes to regulating the media. I listened to the clip you played just, the minister was saying that, they had a stakeholders meeting, which involved also the major players, that's the major tech companies, and they were involved. And, procedures were laid down about how to manage, incendiary content, violent content, health speech, and fake news. And I pointed out that some of these techs already have put in place modalities for carrying this out. So my worry is when the government continues to talk about regulating the social media, when all these are already in place, what it means is that they are looking for something else. Either it means clamping down on the social media, shutting people out. And if you listen to the tone of the resolution of the Northern Governors, it almost sounds like that. And which takes us back to, systems where the government regulate access to the media, and whatever they don't like, they don't want it to. Of what I believe is the issue at stake. So in that regard, my worry is the government has not told us clearly what they are regulating. Are they regulating the content that people post, which already has mechanism of being being checkmated? Are they regulating people's assets? So they should come out clearly and let us know what they want to regulate. But if it's about access, we will say no, because in a democratic dispensation, people have the freedom of speech. People have the freedom of expression. But the freedom of speech and freedom of expression does not allow people to engage in hate speech, does not allow them to propagate fake news. So those ones are not covered by the freedom of speech. So what happens is that the technological companies that provide a platform for social media should be empowered in such a way that they can take down contents that are violent, take down contents that promote hate speech, take down contents that are found to be fake.
Those mechanisms are already there. I mean, Facebook has it.
That's the point.
Twitter has it.
That's the point I'm making. Instagram has it. All those mechanisms are already in place. We know that Instagram locks out people who consistently post news that are not in tandem with their community regulations. So those mechanisms are there. So that's why I'm asking, what is the government talking about now if they keep on talking about regulating the social media? So we need to know. So it's not yet clear to a good number of people in Nigeria. So that's the point I'm making. Let them be clear. Do they want to shut people out like it's happening in China or in South Korea or some of these undemocratic countries? If that is the intention, then it has to be resisted because it's not in conformity with the principles of democracy.
Well, clearly, any government official, any government official will tell you that that's not the plan, but then perhaps we'll wait to see. Let me ask you, Professor Abass, about this. I'm perhaps also taking you back in time a little bit. In the aftermath of the annulment of the June 12 election, there was a kind of clampdown, a huge clampdown on the media at the time. The print media was shut down. Of course, if it's not the state media, there was no information or communication from anywhere. We saw how that ended up. Guerrilla journalism grew and all of that. If we are to situate that with now, and indeed, the government goes ahead and says, if, just a big if here, that it's an intention to censor what people are saying on the social media. How do you see that playing out? What are the implications that we may not be giving attention to now? Should that be the route?
Thanks so much, Ayo, for that question. You've said it all. June 12 annulment, the government thought, and I'm happy you mentioned the word, a big if. The government thought at that point in time it could control people's determination to express themselves, which it tried to using brutal force and so on and so forth. But then guerrilla journalism developed. Tempo and so many other print media did fantastic jobs. Some of them I remember were operating from certain embassies and some other covert places in the country and even outside the country at that point in time. So the government found to its own consternation that it couldn't at the end of the day suppress the people. Look, it's for government to always try, especially when a government is not doing what it should be doing. They will invest in all the negative things that it shouldn't be investing in. That is number one. Number two, and I'm happy you said you use the word a big if. It's a big if. the discussion we're having today presupposes that the government will in fact be able to censor or control or clamp down on social media in Nigeria. And by so doing, if it does that, by so doing, completely shut out Nigerians and Nigerian youth. It is a terrible mistake for two reasons. Number one, Nigerian youths have shown loud and clear they are very savvy. I think one of them sold their app, whatever it is, for $200 million just about a couple of weeks ago. And I was very happy about that. They are technologically savvy. They are smarter than most of our generations and most of the people in government. So even if you were to say you are able to control, you are able to clamp down, which I think they're trying to do, because to be honest with you, the whole idea of control and whatever they are saying is, for me, is a euphemism for saying we are going to clamp down. If they were able to achieve that, that is not going to be it's not going to deter or derail in the long term the ability of Nigerians to freely express themselves. I granted an interview about a month before, permit me to say before the NSA program started, and the anchor asked me a question about the role of the Nigerian Labour Congress, and I told the person, look, if your pains are biting enough, you don't wait for any union to represent you. You will go out and you will make it known. You will protest. You will express your feelings because it's paining you. You don't. And eventually, that is what happened in the country. So don't let's kid ourselves. The government can delude itself to think that by clamping down on social media, by clamping down on print media, so therefore you are going to control the people's will. No. But let me take a step back. What my colleague said, which is what I said earlier on, that there are already private regulation of the social media. So the question is, what aspect of it is the public going to regulate? And I think one thing we are also missing out of this is that the government is not telling us how they are going to balance this with the human rights that the Nigerian Constitution gives to all Nigerians. Nobody has done that. So straight away, there is no question in my mind that the government will go ahead, no matter what you say. Something I've already resigned to the fact that this government.
Well, just one moment, Professor Abass. Just one moment. There's something you said about, what already exists as far as the private, regulators are concerned, the Google, Facebook, and the rest of them. But then the question also came to my mind earlier about what existing laws do we have that already deal with these things that is not doing what it is supposed to be doing? Is that an admittance of failure or weakness on the part of those who are supposed to enforce the law, or the weakness of those laws, if there are any?
Absolutely fantastic question, Ayo. Let me take you one step. Section 2.3 or Section 230 of Section C, Paragraph 1 of the Communication and Decency Act, 1990s of the US, made it loud and clear that you cannot actually use law to go against or to go after social media platform providers. You have to make a separation between the providers of those platforms and the users of the platform. Now, in Nigeria, we haven't made that distinction yet. Look, I am talking to you as somebody also who has been a subject of social media attack here and there, and most of us suffered it one way or the other. But the truth is, if I feel aggrieved enough, all I have to do is to look back into the law. There is a lot of sedition, there is a lot of libel to be able to target, to be able to use that law to target those who, publish things that are uncomplimentary or that are defamatory or slanderous about Nigerians. You can use the laws are there, but there are some laws that we need to be working on, and that is, I think, where the government has dropped the ball, and that calls into the question the real motive of government now trying to rush through this clamping or this control that they're talking about. Because we have a constitution, we have a very active parliament. Go back to the parliament, bring laws to them. Laws can come from Nigerians. Look, Nigerians themselves as citizens, as individuals, they are wary of certain elements of social media platforms, social media activities. Nobody is doubting that. But what the government needs to do is to have a honest and frank conversation with all Nigerians to say, look, we have all suffered this, we are also going to suffer it. How can we genuinely bring all this under some kind of control? Not censorship. Censorship gives me the creeps, because when the government says they want to censor, is the first step towards total clamping down. And I think that is important. That is very important to bear in mind. So let's look at the law that's existing. Let's look at gaps that there are today. Then let's look at how best to fill the gaps. We can borrow from other jurisdictions. There are many countries in the world that we can borrow from, for goodness sake, without sometimes reinventing the wheel. All we have to do is to be able to. I just gave you Section 2.
Okay, let's bring in Professor Ihejirika at this point. Now, assuming without considering that there is a need for some things to be done. Now, the other question is that, yes, government is muting that something needs to be done. And if they were to communicate to you clearly what they intend to do, whether or not it's the content or how some of these things are published and who does what, there are those who also question, should governments be the one leading this narrative, or do you think that perhaps you should have other bodies who should come in and actually examine some of this conversation and find out whether or not it's worth taking a step further? Because yes, people will tell you, from the last social media bill they saw, they just felt, look, if this is the way they want to go about it, then there might be problems.
All right, so the point about all this is that we need to distinguish the three actors in play when we are talking about social media. On one hand are the media platform providers. On the other hand is the government as the regulator of all, and then the policy maker in every country. Then on the other hand is the general users, the users who are both users and content producers as far as social media. Now, what I believe both myself and my colleague are trying to make clear is that we're trying to ask the government, are you regulating access? Are you regulating content? If you're regulating content in the social media, we have to recognize the difficulty in regulating content, because the only way you can regulate content in the social media is through censorship. And once you censor people, they don't have access again. And we say the reason why social media is because it gives people possibility of expressing themselves, and therefore it is their right to do so. So who are those to be involved in formulating a clear-cut way of avoiding, because the issue here is avoiding the negative fallouts of the social media use. We are not talking about the general use of the social media, we are talking about the negative fallouts. And the negative fallouts are hate speech, violence, cyberbullying, and fake news. These are the major negative fallouts of social media use. And so the question is, how do we curb these negative fallouts? We have given the first point that the social media platform providers are already doing something. We already all agree that they have already put in place certain criteria, certain ways of curbing all these negative fallouts of social media use. The second people that should be involved are the users of the social media. And the users of the social media have to be brought to bear on the consequences that can emanate from their irresponsible use of the social media. And in that regard, on the point of view of the users, we advocate training, teaching, media education at all levels. There's a subject we now have, in various institutions, which is media education, especially new media education. Training people about their rights and responsibilities in making use of the social media. On the government part, the government are policymakers. They can make regulations about how these platform providers can operate within the country, especially with regard to mitigating this, but they cannot stop these platform providers from operating. Like my colleague pointed out, the world has gone a long way. Our young people in Africa today are at par with their colleagues all over the world as far as social media use and social technologies are concerned. So even if the government cuts down on Facebook or any other social media platform, they have the capacity to develop their own social media networks. And in that regard, we will continue to start having multiplicity of social media, and the problem, becomes bigger. So in this regard, what we are asking the government is to make policies that can help strengthen the media platform providers.
All right, gentlemen,
Yes.
Let's wind down with this now. They equally talked about policing, the structure of policing. Perhaps it's time to do something about it. What do you think? How should we approach this? Professor Ihejirika, let's start with you.
Is it policing the social media?
No, policing security in the country.
Okay, security in the country. Okay. Yeah. Well, we have always advocated that, police, the security outfits should be close to the people as possible. They are the servants of the people. They should be there to protect the people. The Nigerian citizens deserve, adequate protections from the citizens, So there should be every effort made to reform, reorganize our security outfit to enable them to serve the purpose for which they are set up. And that purpose is protecting the lives and properties of Nigerian citizens, making that security outfit close enough to the people. So in that regard, that also gives room to the discussions about community and local policing outfits. Once the police are close enough to the locality, know their environment, know the people they are serving, and they know that the people they are serving are their brothers and sisters, and whatever happens to them affects them also indirectly, I think it will go a long way to enhancing policing. Part of the problem, like my colleague pointed out earlier, is that our structure of governance a lot of time is far removed from the people. There's a kind of, distance between the governed and the government. So we need to bring policing as close enough to the people as possible and imbibe in the local security officers that they are there for the good of the people, not to extort them, not to harass them, not to intimidate them, and certainly not to make them feel that it is better not to have the police in place. So we are talking, there's need for total reform of the policing system to bring them as close enough to the people as possible.
All right, Professor Abass, talking about policing, much as, yes, you had people who disagreed that, SARS, because, there were those who thought, well, if some people wanted SARS, should the government have said, okay, fine, for those areas that SARS were just not working right, we'll abolish it. And then in those areas where they think, no, reform the police, or SARS hasn't been bad to them, because that conversation also made it was out there at the time, whether or not they should have kept SARS in some areas and scrapped them. But the decision has been taken already. They're over and done with. Now you have SWAT. And so it then raises questions as to how and what how they'll carry out their duties, especially if you then hear the comments of policing of the IGP. Chances are that there may be those who may misunderstand or misconstrue that comment as to they might not have been happy with the scrapping of SARS. And so can we then say that, well, if SWAT was going to go ahead and operate, do we expect fundamental changes, or how should we approach this question of policing in the first place?
Well, thank you very much, Chamberlain. And I'm not going to to reinvent the wheel. I think my colleague has covered quite a lot of good grounds on that, on general policing as a whole. But look, there was need, and there is still need to reform policing in Nigeria as a complete structure from the scratch. Welfare system is poor, training is poor, and so on and so forth. Let me give you an example. I served on the board of Lagos State Security Trust Fund for 4 years in Lagos State here. And I know how much the Lagos State government till today pumps into the RRS, that is Rapid Reaction Squad in Lagos State, and I compare that to, and don't forget, policing is under the federal authority, and I know how much each policing is budgeted for by the country. Sometimes it's not even enough to buy their berets. You have a police that buys his uniform. You have police people that buy their uniform, they buy their beret, they buy their shoes. How can you expect such people to be able to discharge their function responsibly? That is question number one. Number two, look at barracks, for goodness sake. Many police barracks in Nigeria are not even fit for the worst criminals anywhere in the world. Many police barracks in this country are not even up to the standard of zoos. I've been to some fantastic zoos where you keep animals. And we then expect such policing people to come out and do fine job. No, I think we're making a mistake in that. Earlier on also I talked about the need to democratize, the need to put policing and other forces under democratic control, at the end of the day. But straight to the main question you ask in terms of, whether we are going to go anywhere with SWAT. Look, the North came out loud and clear, said they wanted NSAR. They wanted SARS to continue. And I agree with that entirely. I understand, because SARS had been very, very effective as far as some part of the North was concerned in at least securing them. So maybe SARS are just turned out to be a very bad apple in the South. So if that request had come before the disbanding of SARS as a whole, maybe the federal government would have been able to sustain it for the North. But as you rightly said, that is gone now. What we have now is SWAT. The question is, what do we make of SWAT? Well, SWAT is still going to be operating within the same defective, dysfunctional policing system we have in the country. There is no way you can put a very new apple, a very fine apple, in the middle of rotten apples. Bees, flies, everything that come and eat the rotten apple will incidentally, invariably affect or infect the new apple you've put there. So you have to restructure, policing as a whole. So on the one hand, why you are saying, okay, you've given us SWAT, we want to see that SWAT is not a ninja reaction. We want to see that SWAT is not going to be just, call Rose a different name. That SWAT is
as you conclude on this, let me add this point. So why did it work in some areas, that's SARS, and then work in other areas like in some parts in the South? So have we seen enough safeguards to ensure that SWAT doesn't go the same way as SARS in the areas that SARS didn't work?
Straight away, SARS probably worked in the North because the security challenges there were different from what we were experiencing in the South. Whether in the Northeast or in the West and the Northwest, the security challenges there were radically different from what we confronted in the South. So in the South, there was less. So SARS had a free flow. They had a free reign. So the question is whether there is inbuilt mechanism, whether there is enough checks and balances, enough guidelines. That is one question the policing authority must answer, and fast enough. But where they're answering that, as I was saying earlier on, they must make sure that they transform the entirety of police. The structure is completely, altered. It's altered for the better of policing authority. It is only when you do that whatever improvement, whatever guidelines you put on ground for SWAT to operate with is going to be effective. Otherwise, it's going to be the same thing. So I'm going to conclude by saying, look, don't let's waste time. SARS is gone, they've given us SWAT. The most important thing is the government now must go back to the drawing board and see why SARS failed Nigerians as a whole, and that SARS failed completely, and how they can then transform those failures into lessons learned, and now they can use that to channel a better path for SWAT and for the overall policing system in Nigeria.
Well, Professor Ihejirika, just one very, very quick question. In development communication, what are we missing as a nation? Very quick one.
Okay, in development communication, one of the things I normally tell my students in class that when a country is underdeveloped, it means that the general citizenry have not been formed about their rights and their responsibilities. What makes a country to develop is when citizens know their rights and their responsibilities and their contributions they have to make. So the problem we have here is that, first of all, our education system is still limping. As a lecturer, I have to make that point because I'm part of the system. I have seen how things are. And that's why also we are making all the calls for revamping our educational system, investing in the educational sector. It's a very big shame that our country is not yet prioritizing education. And this shows from the budget allocations that are made to the educational sector. Education is the key to development. If we don't educate our children, if we don't educate people about their rights and responsibilities, we will continue to repeat the same problems over and over again. So I will say straight off that one of the things that we are missing in this country is strong educational foundation, where people are formed to know their rights and to know their responsibilities. And that responsibility is about building up the country, making their contributions to the country, and using the resources available to develop the country. It's not about the certificate. It's about social.
All right, so that suggests that, the quality of items or the usage of the social media may be a function of the literacy level in the country, perhaps. Well, I guess we'll have to end it at that point. Walter Ihejirika is a professor of development communications, University of Port Harcourt. We've also had Professor Ademola Abass, who is an international law and global affairs analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today on the program. All right, so we'll be back in just a moment. We've got two gentlemen equally joining us when we return. Stay with us.